Hello! Welcome to Swap Stories, a series for exploring classic books by swapping their gendered language. Today, we'll be reading The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs.
The Monkey's Paw. Part 1.
Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Mother and daughter were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting her queen into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old gentleman knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Miss White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing her daughter from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as she stretched out her hand. "Check. I should hardly think that she'd come tonight," said her mother, with her hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the daughter. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Miss White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog, and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said her husband, soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Miss White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between father and daughter. The words died away on her lips, and she hid a guilty grin in her thin gray beard. "There she is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old woman rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with herself, so that Mr. Married White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as his wife entered the room, followed by a tall, burly woman, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," she said, introducing her. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while her host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass her eyes got brighter, and she began to talk. The little family circled regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as she squared her broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Miss White, nodding at her husband and daughter. "When she went away she was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at her. She don't look to have taken much harm," said Mr. Married White, politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old woman. "Just to look round a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking her head. She put down the empty glass, and sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old woman. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mr. Married White, curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major, offhandedly. Her 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put her empty glass to her lips, and then set it down again. Her host filled it for her. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in her pocket. "It's just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy." She took something out of her pocket and proffered it. Mr. Married White drew back with a grimace, but his daughter, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Miss White as she took it from her daughter, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy woman. She wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. She put a spell on it so that 3 separate women could each have 3 wishes from it. Her manner was so impressive that her hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, madam?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded her in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," she said quietly, and her blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mr. Married White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and her glass tapped against her strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old gentleman. "The first woman had her 3 wishes." "Yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." Her tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old woman at last. "What do you keep it for?" The soldier shook her head. "Fancy, I suppose," she said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale. Some of them. And those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old woman, eyeing her keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." She took the paw, and dangling it between her forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the other, "give it to me." "I won't," said her friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible woman." The other shook her head and examined her new possession closely. "How do you do it?" she inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mr. Married White, as he rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" His wife drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on her face, caught her by the arm. "If you must wish," she said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Ms. White dropped it back in her pocket, and placing chairs, motioned her friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those she has been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for her to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give her anything for it, mother?" inquired Mr. Married White, regarding his wife closely. "A trifle," said she, coloring slightly. "She didn't want it, but I made her take it, and she pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "Why, we are going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an empress, mother, to begin with. Then you can't be henpicked." She darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mr. Married White, armed with an antimacassar. Ms. White took the paw from her pocket and eyed it dubiously. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," she said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with her hand on her shoulder. "Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it." Her mother, smiling shamefacedly at her own credulity, held up the talisman, as her daughter, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at her father, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for £200, said the old woman distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old woman. Her husband and daughter ran toward her. "It moved," she cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money, said her daughter as she picked it up and placed it on the table. And I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, mother, said her husband, regarding her anxiously. She shook her head. Never mind, though. There's no harm done. But it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the two women finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old woman started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as she bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. She sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that she gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, she felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. Her hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver she wiped her hand on her coat and went up to bed.
Part 2.
In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, she laughed at her fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. I suppose all old soldiers are the same, said Mr. Married White. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you, mother? Might drop on her head from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. Moore said the things happened so naturally, said her mother, that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert as she rose from the table. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious woman, and we shall have to disown you. Her father laughed, and following her to the door, watched her down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of his wife's credulity, all of which did not prevent him from scurrying to the door at the postwoman's knock, nor prevent him from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when he found that the post brought a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of her funny remarks, I expect, when she comes home, he said, as they sat at dinner. I dare say, said Ms. White, pouring herself out some beer. But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to. You thought it did, said the old gentleman soothingly. I say it did, replied the other. There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter? Her husband made no reply. He was watching the mysterious movements of a woman outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up her mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, he noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times she paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time she stood with her hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mr. Married White at the same moment placed his hands behind him, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of his apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of his chair. He brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. She gazed at him furtively, and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old gentleman apologized for the appearance of the room, and his wife's coat, a garment which she usually reserved for the garden. He then waited as patiently as his sex would permit for her to broach her business, but she was at first strangely silent. I was asked to call, she said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from her trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old gentleman started. Is anything the matter? He asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? His wife interposed. There, father, she said hastily. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, madam. And she eyed the other wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is she hurt? Demanded the father, wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, she said, quietly, but she is not in any pain. Oh, thank goddess, said the old man, clasping his hands. Thank goddess for that. Thank. He broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon him, and he saw the awful confirmation of his fears in the other's averted face. He caught his breath, and turning to his slower-witted wife, laid his trembling old hand upon hers. There was a long silence. She was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery? Repeated Miss White, in a dazed fashion. Yes. She sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking her husband's hand between her own, pressed it as she had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. She was the only one left to us, she said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard, the other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, she said, without looking round. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old man's face was white, his eyes staring, and his breath inaudible. On the wife's face was a look such as her friend the sergeant might have carried into her first action. I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all. But in consideration of your daughter's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Ms. White dropped her husband's hand, and rising to her feet, gazed with a look of horror at her visitor. Her dry lips shaped the words. How much? 200 pounds? Was the answer, unconscious of her husband's shriek. The old woman smiled faintly, put out her hands like a sightless woman, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor.
Part 3.
In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. Come back, she said tenderly. You will be cold. It is colder for my daughter, said the old man, and wept afresh. The sound of his sobs died away on her ears. The bed was warm, and her eyes heavy with sleep. She dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from her husband awoke her with a start. The pa! He cried wildly. The monkey's pa! She started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter? He came stumbling across the room toward her. I want it, he said, quietly. You've not destroyed it. It's in the parlor, on the bracket, she replied, marveling. Why? He cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed her cheek. I only just thought of it, he said hysterically. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it? The other 2 wishes, he replied rapidly. We've only had one. Was not that enough? She demanded, fiercely. No, he cried, triumphantly. We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our girl alive again. The woman sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from her quaking limbs. Good goddess, you are mad, she cried, aghast. Get it, he panted. Get it quickly, and wish, oh my girl, my girl. The old woman turned and regarded him, and her voice shook. She has been dead 10 days. And besides, I would not tell you else. But I could only recognize her by her clothing. If she was too terrible for you to see then, how now? She went down in the darkness and felt her way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring her mutilated daughter before her ere she could escape from the room seized upon her. And she caught her breath as she found that she had lost the direction of the door. Her brow cold with sweat, she felt her way round the table and groped along the wall until she found herself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in her hand. Wish, he cried in a strong voice. It is foolish and wicked, she faltered. Wish, repeated her husband. She raised her hand. I wish my daughter alive again. The talisman fell to the floor, and she regarded it fearfully. Then she sank trembling into a chair as the old man, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. She sat until she was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old man peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old woman, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to her bed, and a minute or two afterward the old man came silently and apathetically beside her. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaking mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up her courage, she took the box of matches, and striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and she paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from her hand and spilled in the passage. She stood motionless, her breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then she turned and fled swiftly back to her room, and closed the door behind her. A third knock sounded through the house. What's that? Cried the old man, starting up. A rat, said the old woman in shaking tones. A rat? It passed me on the stairs. Her husband sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. It's Herbert, he screamed. It's Herbert. He ran to the door, but his wife was before him, and catching him by the arm, held him tightly. What are you going to do? She whispered hoarsely. It's my girl. It's Herbert, he cried, struggling mechanically. I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door. For goddess' sake, don't let it in, cried the old woman, trembling. You're afraid of your own daughter, he cried, struggling. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming. There was another knock, and another. The old man with a sudden wrench broke free and ran from the room. His wife followed to the landing and called after him appealingly as he hurried downstairs. She heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old man's voice, strained and panting. The bolt, he cried loudly. Come down, I can't reach it. But his wife was on her hands and knees groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If she could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and she heard the scraping of a chair as her husband put it down in the passage against the door. She heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment she found the monkey's paw, and frantically breathed her third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. She heard the chair drawn back, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from her husband gave her courage to run down to his side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
Thanks so much for joining me today. Please let me know what you thought in the comments. Did this version of the story feel any different, or change your perception of the characters? If you enjoyed the video, please also leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one!